1 o'clock, so go ahead and get started. Well, it's 1 o'clock my time at least. All right, welcome everyone to the Site Extraction Simplified Best Techniques for Appraisers webinar, hosted by Aloft's Learning Library. My name is Andrea. I'm a Seattle-based appraiser here at Aloft. Aloft is a technology company that builds solutions and education to empower informed real estate decisions. We'll talk a little bit about today's format. We will be sharing a detailed presentation about site extraction, and during it, you can send us your questions via the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to address all of your questions either during the presentation as time permits or afterwards. And now let's meet our expert educator. Today's webinar is presented by Heather Sullivan. Heather is an AQB certified USPAP instructor and a member of the Appraisal Foundation's Appraisal Standards Board. She is Aloft's Head of Learning and Development and has written several nationally recognized continuing education courses and has taught appraisers all over the country. She's really passionate about the appraisal industry and education, and I'm super excited for us all to learn from her today. So with that, Heather, I'll let you get started.
Thank you, Andrea. I started off with mute, so I appreciate you all for joining today. I'm here to discuss with you about site valuation and all that entails. So we won't just be talking about site extraction. I know that's the name of the webinar. I hope to kind of be pointing you in that direction through the content today, but ultimately we're going to cover all approaches. So site valuation is a significant part of almost every residential appraisal assignment, and it's foundational to credible site, view, and location adjustments. So today I'm going to break down the pros and cons of using land sales, extraction, and allocation, as well as provide some guidance on when it makes most sense to rely on one approach over the other. So you'll probably hear me say it multiple times throughout this webinar. A best practice is always to apply all three whenever possible, and doing so will provide a more holistic view of the property's site and site influences. So let's begin first with the basics. As you all know, we have three primary approaches to site valuation. We have the sales comparison approach, which is the process of deriving a site value for the subject property by completing sales of similar land sales, identifying appropriate units of comparison, and making adjustments to the sale prices based on relevant market-driven elements of comparison. We also have site extraction, which is a method of estimating land value in which we depreciate the cost of the improvements first and then deduct that from the total sale price to arrive at an estimated sale price for the land. Allocation is our third approach that we typically rely upon, and this is a method of estimating land value in which sales of improved properties are analyzed to establish a typical ratio of land value to the total property value, and then this ratio is applied to the property being appraised or the comparable sale being analyzed. What you'll realize is each of these methods have a time and a place in a site valuation analysis, and we'll spend this module helping you decide when to rely on one of these methods over the other. Again, appraisers are encouraged to employ all three methods whenever possible because they can be very insightful for different reasons, and hopefully you'll get that visualization today. So I'm going to start with a poll question. I'm just going to launch it here. Let me see. Andrea, are you able to see it? Oh, I see people responding, so I know it's up and running. So which site valuation method do you use most? All right. I'm just going to close that poll. Hopefully you've all had a chance to respond, share the results. But ultimately, it looks like about 80% use site comparison and then 20% use extraction. I was shocked to see nobody uses allocation, but very good insight. We'll we'll talk about each of these again today, but just to level set with where we're all at, what approaches we've used, I thought that was a helpful question. So as you get in to these different approaches, make sure to do some reflection and see, if you want to change your ways in any way, shape, or form. Okay. My triggers are slow on this. So the sales comparison approach, we'll start with that one because that is the one that is most primarily used by appraisers. But to have a meaningful site valuation discussion, it's important that appraisers are on the same page when it comes to these definitions and the differences and similarities between them. So we're going to start with raw land, and that land, that is by definition land that is in its natural state before grading, draining, subdivision, or installation of utilities. Notice that our reports are actually asking for an opinion of site value, not an opinion of land value. So let's talk about the differences between land and site. And that really comes down to the definition of site now is improved land or a lot in a finished state so that it's ready to be used for a specific purpose. If these terms mean different things, what is the appraiser's responsibility when producing credible results and not being misleading? Well, to put it plainly, the appraiser should not be providing a raw land value for the subject's opinion of site value. And to take it one step further, appraisers should not be using raw land sales alone to estimate a site value. And this is where, in dealing with raw land sales, there's one more step that you have in your analysis that you have to incorporate to cover the true value of a site, and that is your as-is value of your site improvements. And you'll see by definition, it means on and off a site improvements that make it suitable for its intended use or development. On-site improvements include grading, landscaping, paving, and utility hookups, while off-site improvements can include streets, curbs, sidewalks, drains, and connecting utility lines. So thinking about these definitions, do y'all see the potential overlap? The truth of the matter is that vacant land sales are likely to be in some various state of prep or development. So appraisers will have to be very thoughtful in how they report site value and as-is value of the site improvements when performing a comparison and making the site adjustments. And then also, we would expect all these site preparations to be accounted for in those adjustments and site value differences as well. So let's talk about elements of comparison. As you know, when it comes to comparison, there's more driving a property's value than just its location, site, and view. Unfortunately, there isn't a line reserved for all the other things like site improvements and amenities, site utility even, or highest and best use, which we are expected to perform that analysis on every property that we utilize. Regardless, this doesn't alleviate the appraiser's responsibility to fully analyze these aspects or any other impacts that may be potentially happening to the property in regards to value or marketability. Also, think about how the market conditions adjustments are applied in the sales comparison approach, but not recognized in the cost approach to value. Typically, it's the site value that appreciates or declines over time. So with that, we need to be making sure that we bring our land and site value sales current as of the effective date, especially in the sales or the cost approached value, since there's not a spot for that in the actual grid itself. So I always like to add context. I feel like we can all analyze this a little bit better if we have some numbers in our head. So on this slide is a case study that we'll be referring to throughout this webinar. And this is really to help us wrap our heads around the site analysis and put it in perspective. So when researching this particular property, it became evident that this property is not raw land per se. but it is also not a fully developed site ready to be built on. It's somewhere in between. It looks like the biggest accomplishment to date is that the lot has been awarded a Sierra water connection with a price tag of $18,000, of which the seller only paid $5,000 towards this expense in the purchase price of $60,000 in August of 2023. In addition, it's also worth noting that the listing explicitly states perfect spot for a manufactured home. Does this suggest that the site's utility is limited to manufactured homes? If it is, this could limit the site utility and the marketability. It can also change what steps need to be taken to prep the site for development. This is something the appraiser should research further. And then continuing down that listing, we learned that the street is paved and the soil test is available. Electricity is in the street, but not on site, so we'll have to bring it on site. The sewer is not available and no application has been submitted. The property is covered with brush and there are CC&Rs that we'll want to look into to see if it limits what type of development can be done with that site. Therefore, we've identified a few more factors that lend towards becoming a site suitable for development. Now the question becomes, how does an appraiser come up with the value for the remainder of the site improvements? This is probably the most challenging task for us because there's not a lot of good sources. This is the hard, obviously the hard part. And the reason I don't rely on the sales comparison approach very often, true comparable sites don't often occur, especially in the same stage of development. So this method creates a lot of extra work for the appraiser by having to derive and support adjustments for site improvements. And remember, the analysis isn't looking for the cost, but the actual value the site improvements contribute to the overall value of the property as of the effective date. So it could cost more, it could cost less, or it's going to cost what it costs, but it could be worth more or it could be worth less than the actual cost. So that's something that the appraiser has to account for in their as is value of the site improvements. So unfortunately, most cost service providers don't provide cost breakdowns for these items. And really, this is because costs literally vary by site and by project. However, sometimes they try to be helpful and give us some guidance. And so this is taken from dwelling costs. This is the service provider that we use at a loft. And this is what they have to say about as is value of the site improvements. So, and there's more to it. So I encourage if you use dwelling costs that you go to the actual providers page and read through how they calculate their costs, some of their frequently asked questions, and all their other guidance that they provide. It really will help you build a better, it'll really help you use their tool better. And each one can be different. So I encourage you to go to the provider that you use. But in this case, they state the URAR form allows for an estimate of the contributory or as is value of the site improvements. And they put in quote, not their cost. Although the as is value of the site improvements should be based on the value difference between the site and the land with no site improvements, most appraisers generally begin with a kind of rule of thumb starting point. For example, 5 to 10% of the site value, 30 to 75,000 as a dollar amount, depending on what they see in their market. And then that amount, they may be adjusted for properties with extensive improvements when they are contributing to the value. So say, the typical lot is 30, site improvements are 30 to 75,000, but you have a property built, on a cliff, there's going to be a lot more cost involved to make that a sound placement of an improvement. So that's what they're talking about when they say more extensive improvements. So just out of curiosity, and you can put this in the chat window or even speak it out if you'd like. Do you agree with this guidance? And I'm just looking for some feedback in the chat window if possible. All right, I can see I have a shy group. I have one hand raised. Let's see whose hand was raised. Oh, it's down now. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and answer this for you. I do agree with everything, and see that this approach, all the time, and I see this approach all the time in appraisal reports. However, oh, Josh caught it. So Josh Wallet wrote, rule of thumb should be a method. We cannot use chat. Oh, all right. We can't use chat, so you have to use your Q&A function. Sorry about that, guys. But yes, Josh, you nailed it. I agree with everything that is said here, except I don't agree with an appraiser using a general rule of thumb. These costs can vary significantly. And as you know from the example we just looked at, right, the $18,000 water connection alone is 30% of the land value. Therefore, do not rely on general rules. Do your research. It's so critical to getting that site value correct. And a lot of times that site value is the biggest portion of the overall value of the property. So each piece of land will be different in different states of development. They'll have different permitting costs and need to be prepped differently for the type and size of the improvement. So if we're not going to use a rule of thumb, which I hope we're not, then we need to calculate the difference between the land and the site. So how do we do that? Well, we have to do our research. And this can take a lot of time, and you might have to go to a lot of different resources. For example, here is a breakdown from the Planning and Zoning Department of just the permitting process alone. As you can see, these costs add up, and one can expect to pay more for a piece of property the further along it gets in this development process. So here they have, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but they have the pre-application site visit is, $437. And then you have even your geotech is anywhere from $700 to $1,000. For a single family dwelling, a new custom home is about $5,000. And then you get into site improvements that can be upwards of another $2,000 plus dollars. And anytime you have a land disturbance, so grading or clearing more than 0.2 acres is another $2,500. And you saw in our listing that, our site is covered with brush and foliage and all of that would have to be cleared to make it ready to build an improvement on it. So we would be paying most of these fees. And as you can tell, that could add another $10,000, $15,000. In some of the areas I live in, permitting can be upwards of $75,000 alone. So you definitely need to understand what kind of cost those add. And the other part of this is the time it takes. So sometimes that can take 6 months. And, buyers kind of weigh, do I want to wait 6 months? Do I want it now? Am I willing to pay more if somebody else has already done this work? It really starts creating a unique dynamic when we're talking about the overall site value, because all of those things can play into what somebody's willing to pay for that site in the various stages. All right. So out of curiosity, how much do on and off-site improvements cost? And hopefully you got that there's really no gauge, but it can be a lot, right? And Josh, again, with it varies. Yes, every single property is going to be different. Sometimes you can get a subdivision of lots or sites that are prepped and ready to go, and you can gauge pretty well what a site value is. But that happens so infrequently in the work that we do, because a lot of times if somebody's going to create a subdivision of similar sites that are all ready to go, they're going to go ahead and put the houses on it. So we don't see that very often. So a lot of times we're responsible for this. So next question, how much of these costs are included in the replacement cost new that your cost provider provides? All right. A lot of times none of this is. You will want to, whatever cost provider that you use, you will want to go in and look at if they have any information on this. But, even when you're digging a well, it depends on how many feet you have to go down as to how many costs, or your septic system depends on how many bedrooms you're going to have. There's so many variables if you're building on flat ground versus a steep hillside. It's really hard for a cost provider to estimate what those costs are because it depends so much on each unique site and each unique project. So a lot of times they don't tiptoe into that area. They just say, this is the appraiser's responsibility. And we'll provide once you got that all done, we'll provide, for this square footage of a house and these improvements, it's going to cost roughly this price per square foot. They've mastered that piece of it, but this other piece, they kind of throw back to the appraiser and say, you deal with it, which, oftentimes is one of the reasons why our cost approach doesn't align with market value, because in a lot of cases, we're not considering all these different costs. We're not valuing them in the cost approach. So that's one thing I really want you to get out of this session, is that we have more work to do when we do the sales comparison approach and rely on land or site value or site sales. We have to account for what it takes to make them similar to the subject site value. So do replacement costs results in include entrepreneurial profit? And again, this is according to my cost provider. If you use Marshall and Swift or Craftsman's, you're going to want to go to theirs. But for dwelling costs, the answer is no. The replacement cost results do include contractors' profit, but do not include entrepreneurial profit. And entrepreneurial profit, just so you know, refers to the incentive necessary for one to develop raw land. If a market has building sites available, there is often a disparity between cost to build plus the cost of the site and what the value would be for a similar site with a new house on it. And it's that difference between the two that is your entrepreneurial profit or incentive to go through the process of constructing the improvements. So this is, you have some really savvy developers out there, and they know how to get the site at a huge discount for all the work that's going to have to be done. And then you have some that aren't so good at that, and they barely make a profit. And so even with entrepreneurial profit, we can't really just apply a general rule, because it is different depending on the skill set and the abilities of the person developing or the entity developing the site. Can they get reductions in labor costs? Are they negotiating that? Sometimes it's 20 or 30% of the project, and sometimes, it's break even or a loss. So again, we don't have a number for you. You're going to have to use the data to extract the right number. So if you use a different cost provider, again, you're going to want to understand what costs are factored into their calculations and which ones are not. Any cost not factored in by the provider is the appraiser's responsibility to develop. Often, if these costs, it's these costs that are the reason your cost approach doesn't line up with the market. These costs add up quickly and can be a significant part of the overall site value and the overall property value. So we're going to dive into that more with our case study and see how that plays out. Oops, I didn't progress that fast enough. All right, so a few key takeaways before we move on to site extraction is raw land does not equal site value. Therefore, the appraiser needs to be careful when relying on land sales. As-is value of the site improvements may or may not already be included in the site value. And finally, you need to know how your cost data provider calculates cost. What's included versus what is the appraiser's responsibility. So now let's take a look at site extraction. This is an alternative method, and it just so happens to be my favorite method. So hopefully by the end of the day, today's discussion, it'll be your new favorite method, but if not, at least you'll know the benefits of going through the steps, and hopefully you'll try it at least a couple times before you knock it. So here's the math. It's simply the cost approach in reverse order if you need a visualization of it. You take the sale price of the improved property, and then you subtract the depreciated cost of their improvements, and everything left over is your site value. Oop, that progressed too far. So everything left over is your site value. Because you are deducting the improvements from a market-tested sale price, so an actual market value, it already incorporates the market's reaction to these items. So to the as-is value of the site improvements, to the land, to the improvement. So you're already starting from a better place of, being able to capture the market's reaction. Therefore, you can rest assured that you've already reduced the cost down to the land value and the as-is value of the improvements. It does lump everything together, but the best news is that's kind of the way they want it in the first place. But sometimes we will need to use that line at the bottom of the cost approach that talks about the as-is value of the site improvements. All right, so here's how the calculation plays out in the real world. So this is a neighboring sale in the case studies neighborhood. I developed the replacement cost, new and dwelling cost, and it came out to about $214,000. I determined based off of images, property details, and agent comments, just like you would on a comparable, that the property has about a 20-year effective age and a 60-year economic life, which represents about a 33% depreciation rate overall. Therefore, the depreciated cost of the improvements is about $143,000. And I got this number by subtracting the $71,350 from the overall cost new of $214,000. So that's kind of step one in the process. And so if we know the depreciated cost of the improvement is roughly $143,000 and the property is worth or sold for $417,200, this was the sale price also in August of 2023, then we can deduct the underlying site value or deduce that the underlying site value is $274,502. This sale occurred at the same time and is overall similar sized vacant lot in the same neighborhood that our property sold for, that our site sold at $60,000. This calculation is saying a competing property site is worth about $274,000 with all those as-is value of the site improvements included. So we can take it one step further and back out the sale price to learn that the additional site improvements added about $214,500 to the lot value, which ended up being about 3.5 times the land value. So instead of thinking of, the 5 to 10% rule of thumb or the 30 to 75,000, we are talking about $214,000 of added value due to all the things that somebody did to improve that from raw land to an actual site. And now you're probably thinking, no way, that can't be right. But here's the tax assessment from our case studies property year over year. And prior to the sale for $60,000, it was assessed for $14,000 and $11,000 prior to that. And then when it sold and the new owners began, improving the lot, the assessed value jumped up dramatically to $200,000. And one thing I know about assessors is they don't like to overestimate the value, because the minute they do, that starts creating tax appeals. And, it's a lot more resources for them to deal on these individual bases. So a lot of times the assessment is a little bit under what the true market value is. Not always, but as a general rule, we can, we shouldn't rely on these site values or improvement values or even market values, because they're doing mass appraisal. We're doing individual appraisals specific to our market, to the market value, using a couple different approaches. So again, it's a good indicator that we're on track, but I don't think I would use just 200,000 in my site value, because that's what the county has. So let's talk about allocation. So allocation is likely the easiest one to calculate, but can be less credible if not applied correctly. So here are some things the appraiser must recognize. Land values generally appreciate over time. If, think about the last few years, that this has been the case. And what you'll see is that chart on the right-hand side kind of shows how properties depreciate, the improvements depreciate. So that dark blue line on the top is getting smaller, but you'll see the land value appreciating over time and getting larger. So this creates a challenge, because a lot of times we want to use new construction as our gauge for land to value ratio. But if you think about new construction, that improvement's going to be such a larger part of the overall value, because it hasn't depreciated. It's, conforming to what the market wants today. When we get into older properties, we're probably up the chain a little bit, where the improvements have depreciated and that site has appreciated over time. So improvement value depreciates due to physical, functional, and external obsolescences, and then differences in improvements or site characteristics can lead to land to value ratios being different between properties. So unfortunately, like with everything, there is no one size fits all allocation percentage that you can use in any market area. Again, you have to derive your adjustment or your allocation or your ratio from the market, and you need to use comparable and competing sites and improvements. So if you're thinking about a property that has a similar site size but in superior improvements, or similar site size, superior improvements, your land to value ratio is going to be low for the land. And then if you do just opposite of that and you use a property with a similar site but inferior improvements, now your land to value ratio is going to be high. So the key to success is making sure you are comparing apples to apples. All right, so let's do some math. So here we're going to produce two different allocations for our case studies, and you'll see I added a second property just to add additional context and to help make our decision easier at the end of the day. But what you'll see is that we have relatively similar site sizes. So the subject site size is right around 8,500 square feet. The one that we've been using as our neighborhood sale is at 88,441, and then that second sale we just introduced is at 10,173. So kind of in the same ballpark. The improvements, again, are similar. The two improvements for our two properties are pretty similar. You'll see one sold for $417,200 and the other one sold for $410,000. So when we do the math and we take their either their extracted site value, so remember we extracted sale one's site value to be 274,502. If we take that extracted site value and divide it by its sale price, then we get a 66% land to value ratio. So the land is worth about 66% and the improvement's worth about 34%. So a big difference from what we're typical to, but I can tell you I live in an area with high property values, and that's just common. And sometimes they get up even higher than that. It's not very often that they're lower than that unless it's a small site with a really big improvement and usually a newer improvement. When we do the assessment, we go down the assessment path. A lot of times appraisers for allocation will use the county assessor's land to value ratio. And what you'll see is they assessed the first sale for $275,000, the land, and then they estimated its market value to be $476,000. So about 60,000 higher than what it actually sold for. And with that, they came in with 58%. So they got the site kind of in the same ballpark, but then the improvement part, they estimated the improvement to be more substantial than what it is, which resulted in a higher value. So that's where you get that lower land to value ratio that we were talking about on the previous slide. Then when we get to the second scenario, I went ahead and did the extraction and came up with the extracted site value is around 283,000, and it sold for 410,000. So that was right around 69% land to value ratio. And then when you look at the assessment was 200,000 for the site and about 377,000 for the overall value. So that brought in a 53% land to value ratio. So as an appraiser, you have to basically at this point reconcile and determine what are you going to use for your land to value ratio. And some may choose to do the 53 to 58%, or maybe some may only choose to use assessed values as their allocations. I tend to use my site extractions because I think it's more specific to the property at that point in time. So here I personally would use either the 66% or the 69% or somewhere in between. Anything goes. But I can see an appraiser using the other. It just means that your site values are probably going to be undermined by about 10, right around 10%, which can be significant. So this is why I encourage everybody to do all three approaches so you can get a good gauge on really figuring out where your reconciliation should land. The more calculations you run, the more you'll start seeing some consistencies in that. And what I liked about this one is for the first sale, it's the extracted site value is about 274, the assessed value is about 275, and then when I got to the second one, the site value is a little bit bigger and its assessed value or its extracted value is the 283,000. So to me that makes sense with the data that I have. The 200,000 doesn't make sense considering these are in the same neighborhood and you have a larger site. It doesn't, and there wasn't any external obsolescence or anything like that kind of played into why a larger site would be worth less. So to me, that number doesn't make sense with what I know to be true. So with that, we've established site values for the comparables. We can typically now determine a site value for the subject. And so what do you all think? What if I added a couple more? We didn't get into those, but comp number 3 has a water view. And then it's a larger site with a water view. And then comp number 4 is a larger site, but has a similar residential view, no water view. And so if you want to put in the Q&A what you think you would estimate that property's value to be, knowing all the information that we covered. And then Josh, I'm just reading your Q&A. So if an appraiser wanted to use percentages allocation, they should use similar condition properties, correct? Yeah, because new construction, the property is going to be worth more because it hasn't depreciated than a property of the same size that has depreciated. Great question. All right. Okay, Josh, I see 275 to 275,000 to 280,000. Is that where everybody else is landing? $275 from Kathy with most weight on comp number 1. Oh, Josh said, of course, we don't know sale dates and market conditions. I should say they all sold at the same time. Like August of 2023, I think there was one in September of 2023, but most of them were August of 2023. Great question. All right, and Shannon, I see 275 from you as well. That's kind of where I landed. You know, I absolutely see going anywhere up to 280,000 because we know it's somewhere between 274 and 283,000. And then those other sales, now we just have to make adjustments on the grid for those. Those are, you know, just there because there probably wasn't anything better, right? So to do that math, so let's do the math of sale 1 first. So we have its site value of 274,000. We subtract the 275,000, and then we subtract the 240,000, and we get $500, right? Well, the reality is nobody's making that adjustment. So our adjustment on the sales comparison grid between the subject and sale 1 would actually be $0, most likely. If you want to make a $500 adjustment, by all means, go ahead. But I tend to round. And then the math for sale 2, we're kind of in the same boat where we're going to take that 275,000, what we believe the subject site to be worth, minus the 283,000, and we get about 8,300. So yes, we're probably going to adjust that property down about 8,500 rounded. And sale 3 is where we start having some fun. So sale 3, we have the subject that's 275,000, and then we know that sale 3's site value is about 345,500. So we're looking at $70,500 that we have to bring sale 3 down to the subject's level. But where are we going to put those adjustments? We can do it all as a lump sum, but we could also split it out. We have enough data, I think, to roughly split it out. If you think about a comparison between the subject and comp 4. So yes, comp 3 is a little bit smaller, but the comparison between the subject and comp 4, there's roughly about $25,000 difference for site size. If you take that site size adjustment out and assume, you know, they're probably in the same ballpark, that leaves a view adjustment of $45,500. And now the benefit of knowing the overall site values of each of these properties is that really you could have adjusted the site size by 20,000, but then your view adjustment would be 50,000. As long as you stay within those guardrails that you know that comp 3's site's worth 345,000, and you know that the subject site's worth 275,000. So your net adjustments, wherever you put them, however you split them up, they need to be about $70,000. And if they are around 75,000, then you feel really confident in that adjustment and that you can explain that to your client or anybody that questions your work. You have evidence because you have, I'm assuming you probably have the extracted improvements, the sale price, how you got to your land value, and then the difference is just common sense that, how adjustments work, right? And then the final one is number 4. And again, we're just taking that 275 minus the 300,000. We know that we believe the only difference is really that site size. So we're just going to make one downward adjustment on comp 4 for that difference in site value. Everybody agree? I wish I could see your guys' faces. It's always nicer to interact that way. All right. Now, I probably should have led with this, but this was recently published in Fannie Mae's Appraiser Updates. This isn't the full article, so I highly encourage you take a screenshot of that link provided on your screen at the bottom and go in and read the full article. But this statement really hits home and it really aligns with what we've been talking about today. I took a quote out of it because I thought just the way they worded it and everything was, really telling. But they said, we were surprised to find that appraisers often do not adjust for large differences in site size. For example, when the comparable site is at least 3 times as large as the subject property, and they're referring to that top row in the table, appraisers made no adjustments nearly half the time. So we have, and mind you, these are sites of 4,000 square feet or smaller. So you have a site that's 3 times as large. You're probably talking about the actual site being about 1,500 square feet, maybe 2,000 square feet. And now you're comparing it to something with 4,000 square feet, which likely gives it a little bit more room for a garage or some outdoor living space, or just, maybe not touching your neighbors. People pay a lot for that added space. Now they can have a little flower garden, all that kind of stuff. And so what their data is saying is the average adjustment was about 3% of the comparable price by the appraiser. But the contrast was when they ran the average CU adjustment rate, it was more than 5 times greater. So we're making about a 3% adjustment, and their CU modeling is saying the adjustment should probably be around 16%. And that's a big difference. And this pattern also implies that appraisers find little contributory value from land in high density locations, which, come on guys, that's really counterintuitive, right? So Fannie Mae encourages appraisers to re-examine their approach to site size adjustments. And, I'll end it there today because we only got about 10 minutes and I want to leave some time open for question and answers. But I do always try to provide a few takeaways. And really with this, the first takeaway is our site adjustment practices need to change. We really need to have an accurate site adjustment, and that begins with knowing the underlying site value and maybe moving away from land sales as our basis for our site valuation, primarily because there's so much work we have to do that we have to account for, and it's not easy to do unless we're extracting it from a sale. So again, this is why I go back to extraction is my favorite method for all things sales comparison, because it is taking a market value approach. So we're taking something that the market's reacted to, it sold for this, and now we're just extracting all the different pieces to come up with what, that piece of the puzzle added to that overall site value. So again, hopefully you'll leave today thinking about site extraction a little bit differently. I do want to tell you about and there's a QR code here, but if you're looking for a tool that does site extraction and allocation on your comparables pretty much instantaneously, you need to check out Appraiser Toolkit. Loft has a team of really impressive engineers that are building tools for appraisers and with the appraisers in mind. And we understand that we're asking appraisers to do more critical analysis. And so we're trying to build tools that will help you make those decisions faster. And I can tell you one thing that takes a lot of time and deters appraisers from doing the extraction is having to run the cost data on the subject and all of the comparables that you use. And so that is one of the pieces that the tool does for you so that you don't have to spend time on that. So again, check it out. It's one of those things that as we're getting asked to, be more in depth and provide higher quality analysis, you got to have some good tools around you. If you're not using it, that's fine too. Make sure you know how your tool works, what goes into your tool, and that, at the end of the day, you trust the results, that you've really thought through it and can explain those results. Appraisers need a good toolbox. So finally, we have the Aloft appraiser community, and I'd love to invite you all to join it. It's a Facebook group. We discuss topics like this regularly, and I think you'll find it helpful to hear how your peers are tackling some of these similar appraisal problems. So let me post the link in the chat. Oh, I can't get to it. I'll post the link shortly in the chat. It's on us when I'm sharing my video, it doesn't always translate over. So, please, if you're on Facebook, go ahead. We'd love you to join the conversation, provide your insights, your challenges in your market, and hopefully you'll get some different solutions from some of the other appraisers out there. We have a really impressive bunch on that in that group. So, all right. I just want to thank you for your time today. I know Andrea is going to close us out, but just appreciate you taking the time. Would love to further this conversation. So always feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm here to help.
Thanks, Heather. I think I'm not seeing any more questions pop up. Oh, no, just a thank you from Kathy. Thank you. But if you have any last minute questions, feel free to shoot them over. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and close out. Thank you all for joining our webinar today. Before we go, just would like to let you know we will be hosting additional webinars such as paired cost, depreciation, best practices for commentary, and Heather told you all a bit about Aloft Toolkit, and if you do sign up for that, those webinars will come up just in your updates within that page, so you won't miss any webinars in the future. You can do that by visiting aloftappraisal.com to get started. And then we're going to close out today's session, and hopefully we'll see you all on the next one, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.